The irony in this statement that was made by President Ruto that 60% of his engagement in the United States of America was largely about an African agenda and only 40% was about Kenya. The sovereign is puzzled by the president's confession because it is Kenyan taxpayers' money that is allegedly was used exorbitantly in this tour. And so there are really some damaging remarks that William Ruto ought just to have avoided. Now, so we will look at that in this podcast. Kenyans' taxpayers' money were used. And what I'm really wondering here is if 60% of that engagement was about Africa, then why didn't you carry a delegation from any other African country or other African countries apart from just carrying the governors, the MPs, and some few leaders in Kenya? And so it's very critical of that. Now, besides that, I want us to look at the event that happened in Nairobi, and this is the African Development Bank Group. President Ruto President Ruto hosted African presidents, which is the first event that was holding in KCC Nairobi in convention, and this was annual meetings by African Development Group of Africa annual meetings. It was held in Nairobi. And besides this meeting, there's also some other BRICS meeting that was going on here. We'll look at that in some other video. But then, one of the observations was key is that this event was critically important because President Ruto was going to defend his American tour to other African presidents because he says he went there to defend their interests. But then there were so many conspicuous absentees from that meeting. Those who attended are President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, Emerson Ndabudzo Mnangagwa from Zimbabwe, and Mohamed El Mehdi from Libya, the only African president from Northern Africa, and Denis Sassou Nguesso, Republic of Congo, and Hassan Sheikh Mohamud from Somalia. Now, the early report that was released by the diplomatic ministry in the country had shown that they were expecting many African presidents. And some of the absentees included Museveni from Uganda. There was no show or rather no representative from Tanzania. And then understand Samia Suluhu is also heading to South Korea. I think it could be South or North Korea to send some loan facility. Burundi President Evariste Ndayishimiye did not come but was sent his deputy, Prosper Bazumbaza. I think I've gotten the pronunciation right. Other absentees were Malawi, Zambia, and many other African leaders that were expected. Remember, the Nairobi meetings was also marking 60th anniversary of the African Development Bank Group here. And things became so tough. William Ruto forced to explain and defend his stake in the US. Zaire President Specific tasked the president to explain the dividends of American visit, but Mnangagwa seemed to be of an opinion or a different opinion that overdependence on foreign aids cannot help Africa solve the debt problem. Part of this annual meeting was to discuss the fate of Africa and whether the debt problem can be addressed by foreign aids. And I would want you to listen to this discussion that I captured here.
In actual fact, if you look at the facts as they are, in a few decades, the only place in this world that will be having a growing middle class is Africa. The only one. So it is even in the interest of the rest of the world that has marginalized Africa to contribute to the well-being of our continent, because the growth of Africa based on this middle class feeds into the growth of the rest of the world. So they should even be accepting some of these proposals in self-interest. Because Africa grows, the whole world grows. But Africa cannot wait to be handed this opportunity by anybody else. We therefore must be on the front line, really fighting for this right, and therefore for ourselves, but also which contributes to the well-being of the rest of the world.
President Kagame, I want to be a little bit provocative here. I've been coming to Kenya for probably 30 years, and there are places that I used to know that I no longer recognize. Why? Because the city's architects have changed the landscape. Now, most of the Bretton Woods institutions were created 60 to 80 years ago at a different time from the one that we live in. So, if we're going to talk about reform, it's not just the access to resources. It's looking at those institutions that were created back then and asking the question, are they still relevant to the needs of today? What is your thought about redesigning a lot of these institutions to make them fit for purpose?
Well, absolutely. It's a no-brainer that what worked 50 years ago or designed 50 years ago, things have changed.
But to achieve that will require the collaboration of the entire African continent to put resources to achieve that which is possible to service Africa. But now, we work in silos and look forward and look up to Europe or some other former colonial powers to service and develop our own region.
Okay.
I'm happy that now there's a crop of African leaders who now focus on the collaboration of the developing of our respective countries by collaborating among ourselves. It could be in agriculture, it could be in education, and so on. For instance, in Zimbabwe, for all along, we were relying on importing wheat from Ukraine throughout. And yet, it is possible to grow enough wheat for ourselves. When we looked at it and said, how much wheat do we need per year and how much hectares of land do we need per year to grow the wheat we want? That same application, that same approach can apply to every single African country. The continent has land enough, arable land enough to produce food for Africa and surplus. But we don't do it. You still have countries in Africa who import food from Europe. Why? Because we have not broken that link between past colonialism and independence. It is still lingering in the minds of those who have not been able to move away. So, platforms like this one where we share ideas, it is my belief that they're very useful because then we realize that if we collaborate, we have the chance of developing our respective economy far more than when we work in silos. For instance, the former colonized countries by Britain or the Anglo side of the Anglo former colonies speak to themselves. The French speak to themselves. Now, you now have Africa being divided between the divisions in Europe. The English on their side, the French on their side, and they bring that baggage to us. As we are here, I need somebody if I want to talk to my brother who speaks French and I speak English, we need an interpreter. So we must find a way where ourselves as Africa focus on integrating our systems. Let us in Zimbabwe learn languages so that we can speak to Mozambique, we can speak to the Congo. But no, we have to master English or French, foreign languages in Europe in order to speak to ourselves in Africa. My brother here, President Ruto, speaks Swahili. Swahili is spoken in many countries. Why don't we speak Swahili or make Swahili a national a language so that we can speak to each other? But no, we find pride in speaking English or French. You see? So you get married to a beautiful woman because you speak good French or good English. If you continue to speak your own domestic language, your own language, no one, they think you are primitive.
That will provide a mechanism for investment in our green energy resources to facilitate industrialization, to create jobs, to create wealth, and to move Africa to the next level. Subsequently, we came here a month ago. And by the time we were in COP28, the difficulties we had in Paris of whether we need reform of the international financial architecture. You remember the heated conversation we had in Paris, because many countries in Paris did not believe that there was a requirement or there was need of whatever nature for the transformation and reform of the international financial architecture. But by the time we were getting in December, in COP28, there was concurrence in Europe, in America, in Asia, and of course in Africa, that there was need. And everybody agreed that there was need to reform these financial institutions. Fast forward, last month, we had a meeting here with the World Bank to discuss concessionary resources in the IDA window replenishment 21. We made very good progress with the World Bank in that framework. Step forward, last week, the outcome of my visit to the United States, there were two significant outcomes. Outcome number one is investment of $1 billion for the first data center powered by green energy in Kenya. And number two, after extensive consultations with President Biden, and because he confirmed to me that he believed in the transformation of Africa and he wanted to support, because of the conversations we had, you remember, at the Africa Leaders Summit in America last year. And because America is a big contributor both to IDA and to Africa Development Fund, President Biden committed $21 billion that will go to some of it to the two institutions, World Bank, IDA framework, and Africa Development Bank's Africa Development Fund program, which we are discussing here today. The replenishment, the 25 billion Adesina is looking for the Africa Development Fund. And today, Mr. President, we are furthering that conversation with the confirmations we're going to make to enhance significant funding, concessional resources to Africa Development Fund so that we can meet the targets where we wanted, concessional funding, long-term resources, and at scale. I hope I have made a good case and I have met the pass mark. Your Excellencies, I acknowledge the insightful remarks.
And so that is what we've been talking about. The discussion there is about the issue of foreign aid. And so before I break down on how foreign aid is hurting Africa, I want to look at the acceptance of President Ruto's visit in Africa. It's going to draw a lot of disdain, because I remember even a week before President flew to US, he was in Kagame's homeland, Rwanda, and we also hosted Museveni in the country. Now, while in Rwanda, Kagame pointed out some issues about his reservation on how they were struck out of AGOA by the US because they asked US and other foreign nations to ensure that they don't dump their second-hand clothes so that they could protect their textile industries. And Rwanda, just like other three African countries, were locked out of AGOA. But of interest, you might also see that the foreign policy of different countries is very different. Do you understand that now as we speak, UK is struggling to dispose or is trying to repatriate some of their illegal immigrants, and they've picked Rwanda. And Rwanda is receiving some cash is receiving some very good pounds from UK, because UK is going to send the illegal immigrants in Rwanda. So there are so many other factors that are playing, or rather so many odds at stake. And that is why I think as much as the president says 60% of his engagement with Biden borders African affairs, it's drawing a lot of condemnation. It's not clear which tracker President Ruto was actually representing, because in Africa, there are so many other trackers. Is it the position he took over as the person that had institutional reforms in the African Union Commission? Or is it the African Union? Or which trachea he's representing? The perception of the West is one that many countries are trying to shed. And you will understand that they have really been blaming the West for some of the problems that are bedeviling Africa. So it's not really true that as Kenya struggles to look into the West, the other African countries might also fall into that direction. It's not so clear, because you will understand that even China is getting its foot in the Africa fully, and they are really getting impressed by their infrastructure projects. And so, let's look at this clearly. There is an irony that really Kenyans are puzzled about. President Ruto is the champion of the fiscal discipline. Not the fiscal discipline. Is the champion of fair financial architecture for African countries. But at the same time, when speaking to the sovereign, he says that no country should develop with the debts and loans. And so back home, he's maximizing on the taxes, breaking the backs of hustlers for to maximize tax collection. But at the same time, he's the big champion of the countries in Africa to take loans, but at very affordable rates. Of course, there's some few dividends from the US, as he has mentioned. Globally, Africa is the biggest foreign aid recipient, and every year billions of dollars are sent in Africa in form of foreign aid, allegedly for development assistance, with the aim of alleviating hunger, poverty, foster economic development, democratic governance, and rule of law. But the irony of this is that has never been the ideal goal. So when did it start? After the 1939 and 1945 Second World War, America started giving foreign aid. 2 years later, that is 1947. And this initiative began with an economic political interest when America decided to provide economic assistance in rebuilding Europe. And this was after that Second World War. Now, it started from Europe, then it was extended to Africa to rebuild for development. But there's been a big question whether this foreign aid have actually helped in rebuilding Africa. Not so much can be attributed to that. But I want to support what Mnangagwa is saying, that Africa must then continue and look at creative ways and more strategic ways of exploiting its resources. It has the population that have a good market for their own products. So if you read around, you will understand how Africa can produce its own oil and doesn't have to import oil from Europe. Conditional grants and that come in form of foreign aid, this foreign aid come with very many conditions. And a very good example is the UN, is the current IMF conditions that is giving the countries. Before any aid or even any loan is advanced to a country, there are so many preconditions that come with it, and sometimes it goes against even the sovereign. Foreign aids in terms of loans and grants are often packaged as benevolence. But I think the packaging as benevolence is what makes the African president become too greedy and chew that money. Immediately it hits the accounts of government, then what it will happen, the termites will come out of the woodwork and feast on it. You remember in this country we had one of the biggest facility known as the Eurobond. Immediately the Eurobond hit accounts, it disappeared, and any attempt to audit and ask on how that money was spent, you will be told it was overall budgetary support. While the PFM Act 2012 in the country says that no money should be borrowed for overall budget support. The borrowing of any nation, or rather borrowing in Kenya, should be based on specific project. It should be itemized. But that has been misused because at the end of the day, the fight against corruption in Africa is endemic. Then the third aspect why it cannot help to cure is Africa being locked out of the value addition chain in utilization of resources. Now there have been talks about this, and I remember Kagame 2 weeks ago in Rwanda when hosting President Ruto said that it is not bad that all the multinationals in Africa that are using the African resources are from Europe, but at least they should ensure that they set up those companies here. If it is about the coffee, if there is some value addition, instead of taking the lithium from Zimbabwe and then taking it to Europe to manufacture batteries, then come back and sell batteries very expensive in the cars, in the phones, in the TV sets, and many other gadgets, why don't they set up the manufacturing firms that are using lithium to manufacture batteries in Africa? Now that has been the big conversation that the country should be talking about, and they've been locked out of it. So you find out you're a bit disarmed because you cannot speak and ask many questions, because at the end of the day, an African leader, an African president, so long as the stomach is full, does not speak more. Then the destabilization of democratic principles. These are some of the avenues of meddling into internal affairs of countries. This has been a big problem, and many African countries have complained about this. And I want to use a very good example in Kenya. In the last year's general election, 2022 election, one of the dominant narratives that the opposition actually told the nation is that our election were actually affected by foreign infiltration. But what will then be confirmed is that there was a lot of involvement and a lot of funding that foreign nations injected in the IEBC. Now this has been replicated in many other African countries. And what comes packaged as democracy is not really even democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my take. And